Um, are you familiar with Bunga Cast people? Alex and
I've
Truth.
heard of this. What is it?
They're coming from a kind of non for reaching for a catch-all term here. You know, they kind of the non-woke left perspective. They're in it's a general space similar to you folks at Sublation. I'd say almost identical from what I can tell. But anyway, they have floated the idea that part of what's happening with the younger left is that um, they're not particularly materially interested, even fighting for their own material interests. And I think that they have moved in I don't know if you're familiar with. There's a social scientist named Ronald Inglehart, and he talks about post-material values. So we're moving away from bread and butter politics over time, and getting into kind of symbolic politics, identitarian, boutique cultural issues, and so forth. And he thinks that the young left is not. They would be bad. They would be bad hard hat socialists. They're not really oriented that way. Point is, they're just simply not materialist enough for the kind of pre woke left to revive itself. What do you think about that?
Um, well, that's not a new story. I'm not sure youth politics or youth movement have ever been materialist or non. I mean, not that they've necessarily always been bohemian. I mean, Musa Al-Gharbi in his recent book, he brings it all back to the road to Wigan Pier, and that was certainly a leading, very early portrait of the phenomenon. But I mean, you can take it back a generation earlier to, I mean, like in Europe, the Belle Epoque and all that never never pretended to be any kind of vanguard of the working class. That really only began in America. If you've ever seen the movie Reds about Greenwich Village, Mabel Dodge, Max Eastman, all these WASPs that got involved with the IWW. Um, and I well, I mean, the 30s was a little different because the economic factor, and I mean that whatever that would require more unpacking the 30s. But I mean, I mean to the extent, and I'll still say it was a large enough extent. I mean, some of the loopier ideas looking back on Occupy Wall Street are like the post-election, like pure left, no wokeness wasn't the problem. Like I could go on about some specific characters, but like no, but the elite overproduction phenomenon, which Al-Garbi also talks about. I mean, that's absolutely the story of Bernie's first campaign and that period. I mean, I do get frustrated sometimes. By the way, Chris Cutrone and others talk very categorically about the quote millennial left, but I mean, as I argue in my book, I mean, the proletarianization of professional labor is a real thing. Um, it didn't necessarily have to go in the set pattern direction that of elite overproduction, usually leading to the kind of politics, um, the kind of illiberal or frankly anti-freedom politics, I guess characterized by, I guess the Chinese Revolution, or like, I mean, again, I talk about Samuel Huntington and his creedal passion theory is at the core of the American exceptionalism book, and how does he put it about um, it's not about tearing down authority, but to or institutions, but to purify them. I mean, that is a very established pattern that so much of the politics of the last decade fits into. But the same, frankly, was true. Again, to go back to core arguments of the American Textualism book about the progressive era, that you had the Socialist Party heyday coexisting with uh, progressivism, prohibition, which certainly Huntington insists his creedal passion site was always for what he called American creed, value system derived from Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Prohibition was definitely the example or the past precedent in the American pattern of a movement coming out of that was about restricting rather than expanding freedom. But the Socialist Party was very much the more classically Jeffersonian alternative, or lost alternative to the triumph of progressivism, which is what I call it in the Socialist Party. That's in many ways a better way of understanding it than the triumph of conservatism, as Gabriel Kolko called in the title of his book, describing the very same period and phenomenon.
It's funny. It's funny you mentioned that book. People, Kolko himself sort of lamented how much libertarians liked that book, uh, because it was part of their argument that regulation helps big business. And even though he would agree with that to a first approximation, and if I were to leave it at that, he didn't come to the same conclusions that they did as far as dismantling the regulatory state. But yeah, I remember that book was all the rage. I never got entirely through it myself, sort of skimmed it, but yeah, I believe Kolko died, I don't know, last 5 years or so.
Oh, I think more like 10. And he was all, and he,
Okay.
and yeah, no, he definitely was also the most unrepentantly Stalinoid, if not Stalinist, of that whole Wisconsin circle of.
Right.
I mean,
Wisconsin Circle. Yeah, that's a reference I haven't heard in a while. There was William Appleman Williams. Is he from that school? Do you know him?
yeah, I
I think you wrote
mean,
about.
he was basically he was basically its guiding force. Um, it was basically a bunch um, of like young communists at Wisconsin who gravitated around him around the time that the CP was imploding in the 50s.
Yeah, that's the school that gave us the Port Huron statement, or is that something else?
Now, Port Huron Statement was Students for Democratic Society, which
Okay.
had a very different background. Well, this is a thread that runs through. To the extent my first book touches on this thread at all, the book I'm working on now kind of elucidates that, like prehistory of neoconservatism, and but anyway, that I could get into that. I suggested when we were talking someone who I suggested potentially joining us for that discussion. We'll see about that. But
Oh, I'm sorry. So this is a book you're
oh
planning
no,
on writing.
yeah, SDS or founding of it. But really, that's like how there's a way in which neoconservatism can really be understood as a heresy of the new left, because
There was a
the figure
documentary.
who, like, going
There was
back to talking about Raimondo and the crossover, the people my dad knew. I mean, in most accounts, the key figure or the unit figure was Max Shachtman, who was prote- protege of Trotsky. I mean, he really was more the organizational genius than the original thinker, is probably the first thing that needs to be said about him. I mean, in gathering the following around him, he basically just took James Burnham, who he had worked very closely at the time before he suddenly became right wing, and just dressed up uh, Burnham in just traditional Marxist vocabulary, theory of bureaucratic collectivism. That was basically the basis for his sect or following, though there's also a whole discussion to be had. To what extent should orthodox Trotskyism, post-war Fourth International, really be understood as Trotskyism? That also, the current book I'm working on really is useful for clarifying or blowing that up. But the point is, as far as calling it sectarian, no, what he did in the 50s was just, when I say organizational genius, not original thinker, was to consolidate uh, various disparate strands of what was left of the non-communist left, basically in Greenwich Village, um, and basically all the patterns for the new left later. I mean, his core following became violently anti-New Left by the mid-60s, and without getting into the roles played by discrete individuals about how that led into neoconservatism. When I say neoconservatism is heresy of the New Left, um, I mean, the person who really should be understood as the key ideologue there was someone named Irwin Sewell, who became infamous when he became the head of the Anti-Defamation League much later in his life. But he he basically in the early I mean, he had a very Burnhamite but still self-consciously socialist view in the 50s. And in the early 60s, he wrote this pamphlet uh, about the whole scare around the Birchers that basically articulated the whole what, looking back now in 2024, we would call basically the core of the resistance liberal idea of of refighting uh, refighting the 30s in American domestic politics in very totalizing terms. And I mean, if we bring it to the American Exceptionalism book and talking about creedal passion, and again, I borrow very heavily from a lot of the Wisconsin school figures and these concepts, like James Weinstein was the one who used the term war is fulfillment about World War One. And you could describe, I guess I haven't really laid out the creedal passion theory, but I mean, American Revolution and abolitionism leading to civil war, you could certainly describe the conclusion of those periods as war is fulfillment. But really, I mean, like in keeping with Wilson, with the whole Wilsonian idea of World War One, that was the that was that was really the exception, not the rule. War is fulfillment through a foreign war, and obviously Vietnam after civil rights movement, 60s more broadly, that was certainly not war is fulfillment. I mean, it would be a mistake to necessarily call that um, generation neocons that
I'm sorry. What
my
what do you
dad
mean?
knew as Vietnam hawks. I mean, Norman Podhoretz, who really galvanized them, he certainly became, at the very least, a retrospective Vietnam hawk. But but basically, neoconservatism is the heresy of foreign war is the path to the domestic fulfillment that in the original context was associated with the civil rights movement and the Great Society.
Okay. So you say a war as fulfillment and creedal passions. Can you explain what those two things are, where they come from and what they add here?
Well, creedal passion is Samuel Huntington's term, and he was writing in the late 70s to, as a means of placing the 60s in historical context. And it's, as he describes it, when the society's ideals are increasingly in conflict with with its institutions, and you have renewal, restoration, um, or when I use the word purification in making the comparison to which Huntington does. He talks about parallels to a Chinese pattern with a very, very different historic value system that the Cultural Revolution had obviously, but I mean, as I mentioned earlier, patterns I mean, the original Chinese Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century, um, certainly all the strangeness of Taiping and that theology and all the bloodshed it led to. Anyway, but as far as um, does that answer your question? Or
Yeah. Um, so getting back to the neocons, it sounds like the through line there, as far as how the kind of 30s Max Shachtman into the New Left and the 60s Greenwich Village. The through line there is simply New York City politics, perhaps. Um, but I wonder. Oh, indeed. Uh, did you see the documentary "Arguing the World"?
oh, I haven't watched it in more than 15 years, and the project I'm working on now really, really brings home even more than I ever appreciated. Just how bad or much more of omission than commission, to be sure. I think, though, probably a fair amount of commission.
I think it was a PBS production. Maybe it
I
was
think it
Kindle.
aired there originally, yeah. I mean, also for my current project, like reading Alan Walden, I also haven't watched in years. Wonderful movie, which was very emblematic of my big indie film period as a teenager through college, Frida, and not realizing, oh my God, the whole Dewey Commission actually happened there in that house. And there's no suggestion about any of that at all in the movie. I mean,
Oh, the Frida
you could get
Kahlo
into
movie with
how they portray
Diego Rivera.
Trotsky, which is not a black and white question for all that might be somewhat cringe about it, but anyway,
Yeah. Well, I guess in their case, that was at least a major motion picture, not a documentary. So they have
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah.
some license they're free to take. But
And
the
I,
PBS documentary has, yeah.
yeah, I haven't watched it. I haven't watched it. Like there was a whole, like like at the peak of the Harvey Weinstein story, like Salma Hayek had this long essay in the New York Times describing all the all the I shouldn't say horrors, but because nothing like what Harvey Weinstein was convicted of, but let's just say there are uh, certain scenes involving two females that are seen in a clarifying light after the Weinstein scandal, and as
Oh,
some like very openly, no, but no, it is it is a wonderful movie, and and it is probably at least as many years before that article as that article now is the last time I saw it. I have been thinking about watching it soon. Arguing the
Harvey
world.
Weinstein, the Weinstein brothers, they were behind all kinds of you know, what we would not have called woke in the 2000s, but just progressive or liberal films.
Oh,
They did Fruitvale Station. I lived in Oakland. I lived not far from Fruitvale Station. He was behind that movie too, and I remember the director of
oh,
that
well, there's
film
also
apologizing
Michael
for how.
Moore. I mean,
Yeah.
that was the one time it really clicked. I think it was Fahrenheit 9/11. I think it was his immediate pro-Trump film, or not pro-Trump, but immediately post-Trump film, Fahrenheit 11/9. I remember reading a review of after hearing some people say nice things about it, and I just read it and I'm like, oh, this is every Michael Moore movie. And
Yeah.
like,
I remember
but
the golden age of the entertaining political film included Super Size Me and Bowling for Columbine. Well, Bowling for Columbine is a pretty grim subject matter, but Michael Moore
well,
makes
yeah.
it seem.
I mean, I remember liking it at the time, except for the very random interruption of like animated 1619 project interlude that was strange.
Oh,
But no,
yeah.
I guess I mostly liked it when I was 17. And I'm like, oh, this is not some mindless pro gun control film. But what it is just a very aimless meditation on violence in America, um, and that fits into the basically the template that's every Michael Moore movie.
Yeah, there's a vaguely Richard Hofstadter or F scale, what's wrong with America kind of thing going on. Like, but you're right, it wasn't even pro gun control per se. I remember at one point in the movie he interviews Canadian hunters in Canadian areas where everyone
Right,
has a gun. So
exactly.
it's not just the guns. It's not just the guns. Um,
Well, what is or where I thought you were going with this, or this is actually I've talked to Doug Lane about this a fair amount, and I think it is an area that needs much greater mining. Is how much of how much of the story first is the whole Hollywood Democratic Party combination that really began with the Clintons and really did not exist before the Clintons, but was very much a legacy of the Clintons. Um, and how much that says generally about the whole post Cold War era, but also how much of the awakening. I mean, I really am annoyed that I'm just using the word woke a lot here. I mean, I do. I mean, I still stand very much by the term intersectionalism, and with a very
Yeah.
distinct definition or understanding of the doctrine of intersectionality
Well,
in my
woke
American
is just
exceptionalism book. But
it's just pithy.
with that said, but just how much was simply an extension of just things that were very narrowly and cynically engineered by all of the levers that Hillary Clinton had at her disposal to set the tone of the larger culture going into her presidential campaign, but just did not realize the forces they were unleashing. The example that I think the video should still be out there somewhere that as I raised it with Doug. Uh, Kathleen Kennedy never intended to go beyond just uh, girl boss feminism or like 2014 Sheryl Sandberg, Amy Schumer, Amy Schumer. I mean,
Lean in.
the, the Star Wars sequels don't really go beyond that. I mean, my God, like the ending of the third one, the lesbian kiss, and I thought, my friend who was a high school senior watching Return of the Jedi, what very different filter would that have been seen with? But anyway, point is that how many of these levers like that they just had no idea the forces they were unleashing, no appreciation of how much more radicalized the younger generation they were activating was. Um, but um, wait, I was about to lead into something else. I forget.
We were talking about the 2000s Hollywood political film
Yeah, like
pantheon.
I remember when I went to see Team America in the theater and being so annoyed that
Uh,
at the whole Hollywood obsession that they had, and it comes through in that movie. But as time increasingly went on, you look back on that period and just, yeah, there were a lot of segments of society that opposed the Iraq War and opposed the Bush administration after 9/11 for all the right reasons that did reflect the voice of an older principled liberalism. But Hollywood really truly was always phony.
Yeah, if you think about the movies Team America, World Police, and Religulous with Bill Maher, those two, you could be into those two movies. You could tell someone that you very much enjoyed them now, and it by no means means that you're a progressive in good standing at all. I mean, now they're just like the kind of the anti-woke left or the old liberal left, the '90s Democrats as they call them. But
Well,
at the time, people thought, "Oh boy, yeah, you're one of those liberals. Well, you must really really hate those Republicans." It's so much more
well, Bill
convoluted.
Maher is a whole other discussion. I mean, I had come around to looking past his faults basically after Trump's first term, and even after the massacres in Israel, I mean, I knew what I was getting into, like with just the complete mindlessness he has on Israel, and the I can think of one other pundit who I have a lot of respect for, who also has the same story of being a non-practicing half Jew in the way, well, not anything like Bill Maher, how it comes out, the person I'm thinking of, but point is, no, it was when Bill Maher was interviewing Megyn Kelly, and I certainly lost any love I ever had for Megyn Kelly after just um, like the first couple years out of the pandemic, watching her a good bit. But he was talking about the bad guys abroad and Trump is on their side. And I'm like, oh, and I was just stunned at just how completely childish he was
Yeah.
being, or the just whole worldview he was expressing.
Yeah, the axis of evil thinking has come back into vogue among some people. I don't think, maybe not even back into if they're young enough, but it's come into vogue with people um, where I don't think it would have if Trump had not been a phenomenon. They've kind of triggered if you're into it, I'm out of it, or if you're on it, I'm off it kind of mentality among a lot of people. So the people sort of lazily started buying into this um, evil authoritarianism abroad, a threat to the American way, where they used to be skeptical. But yeah, that just shows how much the kind of anti-war and civil libertarian crowd are in disarray and find themselves in increasingly populist right territory now or company.
Well, there's a lot there that comes back full circle to a number of things we were talking about, like about, I guess, deeper roots in the 60s, or in um, creative passion. I mean, at one point about how many people on the so-called populist right, and I mean, you can make the lazy comparison. Sometimes, frankly, it's too high a compliment to some of the like heterodox. Like, I don't want to go too much into the weeds right now of some of the more complicated cases, but just lazy comparisons to neocons in the 70s. Um, I guess one interesting thing in the research of my new book of the very early years of commentary, and when I realized, oh, like free press. No, it's not commentary in the 70s, it's commentary in the 50s when they were just completely sideways, and the boarding party of what they became was very much there, but the allure of the idea of what they were, the torchlight of cultural freedom or whatever, was still very powerful, and had and still had a very strong allure.
You're saying Barry Weiss's Free Press reminds you in some ways of commentary in the 50s or 70s?
Well, when I talk about the
Barry Weiss.
70s, like probably like worst resistance libs on Twitter are the ones that are very online and very worked up about this stuff. I mean, I assume they make the lazy comparison of Barry Weiss to Midge Decter, when whatever else she is, Barry Weiss is the last thing Midge Decter was, which is a sensitive soul, and in many ways to her detriment. And we may or may not want to have that discussion. I um,
One name I remember from commentary, or I might be thinking of Manhattan Institute, is Gertrude Himmelfarb and Sol Stern. A couple names.
oh God, so Gertrude Himmelfarb was the wife of Irving Krystal and the mother of Bill Krystal, who is very much a picture in the dictionary of an OG neocon line. John Roach about Arthur Schlesinger: absolute powerlessness corrupts absolutely. Um, um, Saul Stern was, I don't know if he came directly out of the Wisconsin school we were talking about, but he was very close to Ron Radosh, who did and had the most conventionally neocon, never Trump, or Trump-ish, Trump trajectory in his later career, and I believe is still alive, very up in years. Um, but Saul, yeah, no, Saul Stern, I think had also been never Trump, and I mean, he did have a hard edge, I think, to a lot of the things he wrote, and I remember just how stunning it was, and obviously any number of developments have intervened since then, but obviously time marches on. But I just remember how shocked I was at just how shamelessly he was attacking Chris Rufo when he first came on the scene, given what his and I mean it was there was definitely a personal angle just regarding the Manhattan Institute. I don't know if I want to mention about the brother of Gertrude Himmelfarb, Milton Himmelfarb, who has some significance. Well, certainly to my first book because that's all written down, but um, but no, just the larger story about the intrigue in the American Jewish Committee that led to commentary. So the book I'm working on now is a history of what was known as Menorah Journal, um, from 1915, 1961. In a half-abandoned dorm I like to call the Grand Budapest on the Ohio, because that was a very distinct vibe when I first walked into it. You can imagine it. American Jewish Archives on the Cincinnati campus. Um, I was going through the editor of its entire existence, 64 boxes, lifetime personal correspondence. Um, so it was founded by what was called the Menorah Society or Menorah Association, which was the first collegiate Jewish organization before Hillel, but had much more an ambition to groom an intellectual elite. And um, and they had been in existence for a number of years. When they launched the journal in 1915, the association was a casualty of the Depression. Um, the journal lasted until the founding editor, Henry Horowitz, died in 1961. Um, but no, it contains multitudes. If we have a follow up at any point with um, this individual we've talked about, or who I brought up to you, we might go into some of the more discreetly uh, Jewish um, multitudes, obviously, but the founding editor of Commentary, his name is Elliot Cohen. He, in his youth, was the managing editor of Menorah Journal and had like all kinds of like 1920s smart set era conceits, and or had that conceit, and it led to some very good stuff, some amazing stuff coming out through the journal. Um, he was also quite mentally ill and had like in what may be familiar. He was very much someone who would have thrived in the age of Twitter. Just the nature of his personal preoccupations, um, but basically the group around him that broke from the journal during the Depression and was on the left, and a number of whom became very close. The one who became the closest to Trotsky was someone named Herbert Solow, who was a fascinating and much biographically neglected individual. But Lionel Trilling is probably the most famous name that was in this circle. But this
Who's
really was the
who's a
beginning.
novelist? Wasn't he a novelist, or did he only do nonfiction? I believe Lionel Trilling.
Um, I don't think he wrote fiction. He was a critic. He
Oh, yeah, I think I'm thinking of Irving Howe.
was a
Actually, I think
literary
Irving
scholar.
Howe wrote fiction.
Yeah, he was
Right.
so, like most accounts really locate the beginning of the New York intellectuals, and without getting into the untangling of to what extent that's one and the same as the prehistory of neoconservatives, they mostly associate with Partisan Review, which launched which broke from the Communist Party in the late 30s. It was launched by the Communist Party when this same group, which I think only one person who was later also the most of a movement Trotskyist, which was Felix Morrow. I think he was the only one who ever actually joined the Communist Party in the very early 30s. But it was this group's break that the communists responded to by launching Partisan Review. And so, in many ways, so really, this is the beginning of the New York intellectuals. But I mean, there's also, as you go in the later history of the journal, how it was, where it stood vis-a-vis the rise of commentary, and also about Zionism. I mean, I mean, commentary was, for lack of a more precise, for lack of more precise terms, and more precise terms really are important here, in up through the very early 50s, commentary was actually almost as anti-Zionist, or certainly critical or non-Zionist. Again, very much, these are complicated semantics of the moment, and I could talk about my first book, and I mean, and the later period of the journal's existence is very tied into the subject of my first book. Um, but I mean, so the short version, or summation of all of this is, I mean, I always thought since I was very young, I wanted to follow up um, the book on the Socialist Party with neoconservatism. 2015, even before we realized that Trump was the story, just the sense that there's some much bigger story, um, and and American exceptionalism. There's a lot of ways biting off more than I could chew, and what is or isn't my calling or whatever. But there are certainly many good things as far as being back on the track I had set out for myself and what I was ready for. But the point is, so this is the prehistory of neoconservatism. Before I intend to follow it up with neoconservatism proper, beginning with Podhoretz in the 60s. But it's a totally different story, the prehistory, than would have been apparent when I was in my 20s or younger, and reading Raimondo, and how much uh, Max Shachtman in particular is at the center of it. It's a totally different story than was apparent in any of the Bush era discourse around the neocons.
Okay. Or that PBS documentary.
Well, that's something else. I mean,
Right.
mentioning Lionel, I mean, no, Diana Trilling. It was funny when I realized, talking to a friend, that basically she has the she has the same role in saving that documentary that Shelby Foote has in Ken Burns' Civil War.
Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah. We could talk for so long about New York nonfiction literature. Well, is it even literature if it's nonfiction? It's something to read. But anyway, we could talk a whole about the journals ending with the word review that all seem to emanate out of New York City. I remember Lou Rockwell's print magazine definitely did not emanate out of there, but I remember in the 2000s, Lou Rockwell getting into dialogues with the Telos Institute, started by Paul Picone, the
Oh,
Italian Marxist.
yeah,
So there's so much going on
yeah.
here. Jacob Siegel and Jeff Schellenberger had a really good conversation about that like 4 years ago. They really got into the weeds. Apparently, Jacob knew Paul Picone personally,
Well, I'm very
but yeah, that
excited that Schellenberger is going to be co-hosting the new Compact podcast with Ashley Frawley of Sublation.
yeah,
And
that's interesting.
um,
Nina Power out, Ashley Frawley in, and
well, Nina has apparently for a long time, I didn't realize, had this film podcast with a number of our collaborators, Ben Studebaker, and should really become more of a culture podcast, or more general culture podcast. And that probably is much better suited to Nina's talents than politics. Um,
yeah, she's more of a culture. She's a sophisticated culture person. I don't think she's as interested in getting into the weeds of American politics as Jeff. Not just because Jeff is over here and she's over there, but uh,
but that
I'm
actually is a perfect point just to talk um, about Sublation and plans for the future. Been, I guess, for more than a year, had it on me to develop a strategic plan that's gone through many stations, and we're having a business meeting sometime before the holidays. But I mean, as far as Nina being out at Compact or and whatever store app, I could say some things about some of the funnier things about Sorab. I've certainly an extremely nice guy the times I've met him. Um, but no, I'm delighted that he is at Unheard, and that's where he's starting now. Because I mean, Emily Jashinsky. I mean, that any hope for there still being decency in what we've hoped for in online media replacing what came before and not being worse. I was a huge fanboy of Breaking Points, and I'm very disillusioned. I think I've made enough clear about my about how about my views about Zionism and a number of things I've written in the past that how Krystal totally went off the rails on the issue was what was finally the last straw for me. But
Crystal went
no,
Crystal
there
went
is
off the
like
rail. Crystal went off the rails on the Israel issue on Breaking
yes,
Points.
yes. And it didn't happen right away. At first, right after the massacres, they were totally nailing it with just presenting the news and saying what needed to be said on all sides. But then, as time went on, but
And
um,
I'm sorry, in what direction is her going off the rails?
um, uh, on pro-Palestinian or
Oh,
just
okay,
just
okay.
completely on. She's as far as I know, she has still yet to cross the line into tankydom, but just completely uncritical of the protest last spring, and I could go on.
Uh,
But anyway,
well, we might we I'm kind of sympathetic to the tanky left on that issue, but and it comes from a kind of Raimondo paleo libertarian
oh,
perspective. So
okay,
that's a whole
there is
other
so much we can talk about another time. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, but um, anyway, I just want to make the point as far as where this conversation started about the kind of left and whether I mean I feel I identify more than ever about how to even identify this what seems to be consolidating in like around like compact unheard, and I certainly hope sublation a tendency about whether, to borrow the phrase from my American Exceptionalism book, new vital center or just populism, but more than ever identifying with the platypus slogan, the left is dead, long live the left. Um, but that really is forming now, and having alluded in a lot of the stranger parts of the first part of this conversation, as the strategic plan is developed, just realizing just how many of what I felt for a long time were nuttier parts of my youth, or ideas of my youth, how it does seem to be cohering into this new thing. And there are a lot of people that are part of this plan that's coming together that I hope can come on your program, and that you can be a part of, and for purposes of this continuing conversation.
So, thanks,
Okay,
Jeff.
terrific. Thanks.
Cool.
This
Thanks.
is fun.
Take
We'll
care.
be in touch soon.